Get those managers developed throughout your organization, having them understand exactly what engagement is about, the role they play in the whole engagement scheme. It's not just the organization that comes back and our scores were very low. Well, that comes back down to every manager.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending upon what parts of the world you're in. If it's Friday, it's the CEO series. Our guest today is Elizabeth Talerman, who is the CEO of Nucleus Group and partners. She partners with leaders, establishing meaning, clarifying purpose, streamlining decision-making, and turning strategy into action. She worked with CEOs and management teams spanning both commercial and the social impact sector. She has a stellar list of clients. It would take me probably 15 minutes to read through all of them, but she advises startups, family-owned businesses, and multinational brands and brand owners alike. She serves as a mentor and coach to leadership teams to help them define brand values that support distributed decision-making, increasing organizational capacity for innovation, and it goes on and on. And she was a former senior vice president of marketing at Martha Stewart Living, where we met umpteen years ago. So thank you very much for being a part of the CEO series. How are you?
Oh, Ron, it's a pleasure to see you. I am well and enjoying summer here out at the tip of Long Island. Where I've been since the pandemic started, but we're looking forward to making our way back into New York City soon.
Okay, cool. So as you advise these organizations across the globe, and you have a global imprint of the Nucleus Group, what are some common themes that you're picking up as organizations try and right the ship, get it back on target?
You know, if there's one word that comes to mind, it is uncertainty and managing uncertainty. It is so difficult to be in a position of leadership where you've got gathered wisdom and experience and be thrown into a situation where there are no prototypes. There is no experience to learn from. There is no guidebook. Yeah. And so the uncertainty leaders are facing about when and whether to bring people back together, what to do about requiring vaccination or not, whether or not work from home was actually more productive, where the metrics are, the level of uncertainty they're actually projecting onto their employees, the way they're making a decision and then retracting that decision, that's reverberating through the base of employees. And so we've got a period of pretty high corporate anxiety, I'd say.
Yeah. So from a leader's perspective, and then you have the employee perspective, what is a way for organizations to try and bring those two together to try and understand both sides? Is there something that you're experiencing as it relates to that?
We prototype most of the strategic advice we give right in our own company, and we may only be a small group, but I will tell you that I think the way to overcome uncertainty is dialogue, and to structure that so that you have working groups, you have town halls, you have sessions where leaders are allowed to say, we're not certain here. We don't know. And we need to work with you to define these things. Because the worst thing in the world you can do is be certain and then uncertain and then certain again and go back and forth like a yo-yo.
Yeah. And we've seen that play out in the news lately from companies issuing these statements about the new policies and employees rebelling, as a part of that. So I want to ask you a leadership question. You said the role of leaders in moving this forward. Do I feel comfortable in saying I don't know? Because I've always been the type that says I know everything. Or I tend to be the so-called answer man, an answer person. What are the dynamics centered around that? Because that can fall into a new competency for leaders in trying to, let people know that we're kind of all in this together.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I don't know that the words "I don't know" have to be the starting point.
Okay.
I think that the starting point is we're in an unprecedented space. We're in a space that no one's navigated yet.
Yeah, yeah.
And so our ability to work together and create that path and develop that roadmap means that we can build capacity within our organization and model that for others. And isn't that the true definition of leadership? Leadership isn't having all the answers.
Yeah.
It's modeling process in order to get to the places you want to go.
You in an article you wrote, it's how to design an organizations that thrive. You mentioned a pet peeve of mine, which is the old trusted so-called org chart, which lays everything out in layers, and the decisions go from here and they cascade down. Give us some insights on that, because that's a pet peeve of mine, as I said.
And I think that's why you and I understood each other so well. We were in an incredibly hierarchical organization, but with people with such extraordinary skills, you couldn't just operate that way, right? We had the off the books org chart and the on the books org chart. There's a certain amount of hierarchy that allows for efficiency and comfort. But if we understand how startups grow so rapidly and scale, what we start to see are leaders that use brand and values as the hallmarks for distributing decision making.
Okay.
If you have distributed decision making, you can move more quickly. People can make decisions with comfort and surety. So I believe that hierarchy is only important in creating a comfort so people understand, who do I go to? Where do I get this or that from? Yeah. But when it comes to making decisions about the work, then you use organizational values, make sure that they're universally understood, and then allow the expertise of the people you bring in to shine.
Okay. Give us an example of that in real life. I understand exactly what you're talking about, but then again, you and I kind of meet eye to eye. We understand each other. Yeah. But for someone who's listening, and we have a lot of people who's listening that's kind of first or second stage human resources or org design, development people, or CEOs, give us an example of how that works in real life, maybe from a case study that you worked on with your clients.
Absolutely. So for years, I have worked with and been on the board of a paper company, fourth generation, almost 100 years old. And the CEO of that organization grew up in that organization, but he does not have a PhD in material science. And as much of this is in his bones and his blood, he is a leader and understands all the components of the business and how it works together systemically. But when it
Okay.
came to innovation, he
Yeah.
could not lead there. His
Yeah.
job is to manage risk, not to
Mm.
take risk.
Okay.
And so there was someone in the organization, and what we allowed for was in working groups, actually gave that leader permission to have a working role, to
Okay.
have a role to review how the systems could work, but not lead the meetings and not have the ultimate definitive voice in the meetings.
Mm.
So sometimes, while it seems counterintuitive, the traditional hierarchical leader actually needs to be relieved of certain responsibilities
Yeah.
and released from those in
Mm-hmm.
order for someone else to take ownership of some of
Mm-hmm.
those. And that's actually truly a relief.
Mm.
If you're part of informing a decision, but don't have to ultimately make that decision, it's a
Right.
new role and you have to learn that. But it
Mm.
really can accelerate the way innovation happens, for instance, or the way the continuous improvement process happens. In
Mm.
that same organization, it was literally the machine operators that knew some of the vital improvements that had to happen, not the CEO. The CEO doesn't operate the machines.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I did this because it meant you nailed it. You hit bullseye. I've always felt from my consulting side is that you go to the audience that's going to be impacted on that. And the person who operates the machine is a subject matter expert. So I was listening to a podcast the other day, and someone asked the question of two senior leaders, and they said, how many people do you have working in R&D? So this person was kind of thinking and said, maybe 10 people. And he asked the other CEO, and he says, I have 1,500. I said, what do you mean 1,500? He said, I have 1,500 employees, and I want all of them to adopt a mindset that you're in R&D. If you can figure out a better way to do it, let's do it. And that lessens the process.
That's right. Anyone should be able to provide what we call an OI, an opportunity for improvement, and put that into a system. And then you can take a multi-level approach for prioritizing how those get solved. But if everyone in the organization is not empowered to deliver an opportunity for improvement, then you're going to have an organization that has bottlenecks and issues and problems. So,
Yeah.
You've got to empower that employee set from top to bottom.
Mm-hmm. So, I know of your work, and I know you're a global organization. Can you walk us through how your organization kind of dealt with this pandemic? You said, I know you were in Brooklyn, and I know that you're now out on Long Island. For the people that are not aware, Long Island is kind of a long ways out from New York City, a couple of 2-3 hours in driving. And you have kind of a global operation. Can you walk us through the structure of that not really from an org perspective, just from a location perspective as to how you rebuilt your organization post-COVID?
Sure. So when the pandemic was sort of officially announced, or travel bans in the United States were officially announced, I was in London at a workshop facilitating a working session with the European Leadership Network. And in the middle of the night, my other half called and said, I got to get you on a plane. There's a travel ban. We didn't know what that meant. None of us knew what that meant,
Yeah.
right? So back I come from London, out I go to Long Island. We are a small, tight organization. My business partner, who's also 20 years my junior and was once one of my graduate students, called a few weeks later and said, look, I've got twins in a 3-floor walk-up, and there are protests washing through the streets of Brooklyn right now in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And I don't know what to do. There aren't enough masks to mask up my twins and my husband and myself. All of a sudden, my business partner, who was 5 blocks from the office, moved to St. Louis, bought a house online. Our senior strategist, Miguel, was moving literally between Beirut, London, and Paris, and has mostly settled in London, but goes back to Beirut when she needs to. And we have one person that's sheltering in place still on the Jersey Shore and another in Queens.
Okay.
We have something we call the kitchen table culture. We used to come together every single day around my kitchen table. And that's where we worked. And we fed each other with information and knowledge and food, and fueled an incredible camaraderie for some very intense global work. We had to replace that kitchen table. And we've done it virtually. Now that we're far flung, we're going to stay that way. We have found ways to be together. We're just about to do our first reunion or offsite. We're all going to gather in Woodstock, New York. We hope our next one is in London.
Woodstock, okay.
In Woodstock, the you know, cliche as that is, we're going to bring it together in Woodstock. And once a quarter, we'll be together, all together. But our work does bring us together, and we travel to different locations around the world. But I don't see a strong reason. We've seen no reduction in productivity by being a virtual team. We have had to make certain accommodations, though. On Wednesdays, we block meetings. And if we do have to have meetings, cameras are off. We need that the retraction, if you will, from visual stimulation. And Fridays are flexible. You can work, you don't have to work, you can engage in enrichment activities. We took subscriptions to Masterclass so that people could have some of that water cooler time. And in spite of having these 2 less structured days, we have seen measurable productivity increases.
That's what I struggle with and I'm based in the Middle East, based in Dubai, is talking to leaders and trying to get them to understand this new wave of working, this new model of working, because they're so connected with everyone being in the room. They want to make sure everyone is here. And from the side of the virtual aspects of managing people, they're struggling with. Because the model they grew up with was always having everybody in the room and they can see everybody. Regardless of what they were doing, they felt comfortable because they were seeing everybody.
Yeah. I'll tell you what I miss. I miss that, hand on my shoulder. I miss the physicality of working together in the most positive way. But we find ways to replace that. There's a quarterly care package that goes out, and we switch back and forth with each other. There is there's a lot of things we're trying to do to replace that. But I will say that I'm on the cusp of being a boomer and a Gen Xer, that last year of boomer.
Okay. Yeah.
I understand the desire to sort of have things the way we grew up in business. But my team is entirely millennial and Gen Z, and they really do have different ways to be productive, and honoring that, understanding that, listening to them, and allowing them to define some of the ways we work together has absolutely had a materially positive difference on our business.
The key word to that was listening. You listen to them. And this is what I was talking about earlier. If you're going to impact a certain portion of that employee base, you have to get their insight. But what I find from my side, and one of the things I find about working globally, you find a leadership concept is different in different countries. The boss is the boss. We're trying to look at it a different way. But listening, can you talk to us how important that is as a leader as to how they should listen to 1,000, 1,500, 20,000, 30,000 employees, and we can't just sit in this dome and create a decision and push it out by email and expect everybody to kind of tag along?
You know, I've 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 learned about listening by listening.
Mm.
And the first was when I was at Martha Stewart with you. We were starting a food program with Costco. We
Okay.
went to Kirkland, Washington, and there in this enormous convention center, because once a year they have this big convention.
Yeah.
It was 6 o'clock at night. I saw the CEO of one of the world's great businesses sitting by himself at a big round table that you'd see at a conference. He had cards. He was handwriting out the cards for the 10 and 25 and 35-year kind of anniversaries. And I said, "May I interrupt you?" He holds listening sessions. He
Mm.
goes to the different retail locations and
Yeah.
holds breakfasts.
Hmm.
I learned this from many CEOs who
Yeah.
will take in 15 employees once a week and do a Wednesday morning breakfast.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the idea of those breakfasts is to ask 3 questions and to offer no advice.
Okay. Okay.
I think it's
Yeah,
vital.
it is vital because I just want to listen. Let me know what you're thinking. And that's kind of the concept, around that, of what can we do to improve whatever the process is. I saw a post online the other day, the CEO from Lowe's, Home Depot. If people that's from a different region, Lowe's is kind of a store that you can go there, and for the do-it-yourselfers, it's the kind of store. And they said sometimes when that CEO will just pop in, put on an orange jacket, because they always wear these jackets, and he'll go out and help customers just to spend some time working with the customer to try to get some insight as to what they're looking for. They don't know who he is, but he's the CEO and executive chairman of Lowe's.
Yeah. Prior to joining Martha Stewart, I spent a few years as the marketing director at the Harvard Business School, and I was specifically focused, this is in the 90s, there was a recession, on ensuring that executive education at the Harvard Business School was robust and was well attended. For the first time in their history, they didn't have full classrooms. And Harvard Business School executive education is for CEOs only, global,
Yeah. Yeah.
multinational CEOs. I made it my business. If there was a request for information, I put together a team that would call back within 2 weeks of that request being made,
Whoa.
saying, "Can we answer any questions you have?" I
Mhm.
sat on those phone lines once a week, making those phone calls.
Mhm.
I also, during executive education sessions, would go to the cafeteria, the sort of restaurant we had for our guests, our participants, and I had lunch with them once a week. Sat in, listened to them talk to each other, asked them questions. I got to sit next to Leonard Lauder and just
Oh.
hear what his experience was like.
Mhm.
I sat next to former astronauts. First of all, it was mind-boggling to me and enriching, but it helped me reposition the way we went to market with the programs. And I couldn't have gotten that if I wasn't sitting there listening, to your point.
Yeah. Yeah. Coming out of the so-called executive suite, where all the supposedly brains, are occupied by that sector of people. When I was at Martha Stewart, every Friday I would drive to Connecticut, TV studios, and I'd go there, and people said, "Why you go there?" I said, "Because I want to get to know people, and I want to know what they're thinking about. I don't want them to think that's an outcast, because as you know, that's probably 2 hours away from where I lived." But I'd get up early. I'd drive there every Friday and sit there and just kind of listen to see what was going on.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Makes a lot of sense. So from a leadership perspective, if organizations maybe realize, and since you were at Harvard Business Review, so that's about leadership development and all those kinds of things. If you had to give 2 or 3 key points for the new level of leaders, what should they focus on?
So most of my practice is based in the principles of human-centered design. That
Okay.
means that your perspective can't be from the organization out.
Yeah.
There has to be a two-way connection.
Mm-hmm.
And so the most important thing I think we need to think about as leaders is, how do the ambitions of the organization and the brand align with the ambitions of the people it serves? And that means the employees for the leader and the customers or consumers for the organization as a whole. If you don't understand the ambitions of the people you serve and you're not aligned with those, you can't succeed.
Yeah. So, I gave a speech yesterday, I think it was yesterday, to a global audience based out of New York City on the employee experience. And that was my last slide. I said the old way of looking at that triangle, that pyramid, was shareholders, customers, and then employees were last. I said, forget about it. Employees are going to be first, customers second, and then goes down to the the shareholders. So that's a totally different thought process. So
Absolutely.
a project I worked on here was with a major airline here. And that was the session that we did on cascading vision strategy. In other words, this great topic that you're talking about, here's what we're going to do. We want to be this, want to be that. What does that mean for this employee down here? And this was an airline that's putting the bags in the plane. It's 110 degrees outside. Can they understand this lofty statement that you're talking about?
That's right. That's right. And that the notion of jargon, right now, we've dedicated the Nucleus Instagram feed to debunking jargon. The being plain spoken and ensuring everyone can speak the corporate language, and that it's not encoded, and that it's not thick and rich. Sometimes I think leaders think they need to speak in lofty ways. The loftier you are, the less anyone can hear you. I go back to Dr. Seuss and Yertle the Turtle. It's that turtle at the bottom that's the most important one. Otherwise, the whole thing topples over, right?
Yeah, I always use the analogy when I'm facilitating these sessions. I said, you remember in school when somebody would whisper something in this person's ear, and it would go around the room, and then when it came down to here, it was something totally different. How did you arrive at that? But this is what happens. Yeah. Because these lofty kind of visionary kind of thing, I don't understand that. I just came right out of high school, and I'm not using this to say educational level, but I'm saying I'm just working on a job here to try and provide for my family. What's in that for me? So
And what in that gives me a story to tell other people that I'm proud to tell. So, I'm gonna take this to something as simple as snack food, right?
Okay.
Oreos, an Oreo. There is a one-word brief for the entire organization, right? It's called wonder-filled. And as soon as if you know what an Oreo is, those two chocolate cookies and the cream inside, everything about the brand, about the product is wonder-filled. Now, how do I take that super simple, evocative term and translate that into how I do my job? What is wonder-filled about my position on this line? What is wonder-filled about my position managing HR here? I think the one-word brief is the key to getting it right all the way through the internal value chain.
Yeah. When I was going through your bio, purpose organization, the organization's purpose filled. So we talk about empathy, but we talk about the organization as the as Josh Burson would say, the irresistible organization, but it's based on purpose. It's what people are looking for now. How can if you had to advise a CEO that was clueless as it related to the so-called soft side, and they were all technically driven, by the numbers, getting the numbers in, but don't realize that the underpinning of that is the people. How would you have that conversation from numbers, so-called stockholders, to the purpose side for the employee that's driving that?
Sometimes it helps to take a CEO out of that decision-making framework and put them into their life framework. And I often will say, tell me about the last car you bought. I can guarantee you with most CEOs, they'll come down to rationalizing the engine or the horsepower or the this or the that. But that decision, that initial decision, they'll start talking to me, and the language they're using is emotional and it's aspirational. And it's also about the reflection of who they are. Mm-hmm. And then I'll bring it right back in. And I'll say, making the decision to work in this organization is just the same for every one of those employees. What are they going home to tell their spouse, their children, their parents, or their grandparents? Where is their pride of purpose? That's number one. And then those metrics back it up. Our decision making starts in the limbic brain, and then we rationalize things for everything we do as human beings, because the limbic brain is the most developed part of our brain. It's the part that starts us out as babies. We cry when we're hungry. It is incredibly sophisticated, but it is built on emotion first. Every decision we make based on emotion and then rationalized. I believe in metrics and evaluation, but I believe if you don't understand the emotional reasons someone's engaged, then those metrics won't happen.
I love the metaphor you use that in having that conversation with this senior leader, taking them out of the context of what they're dealing with and taking them to a personal side. Because I thought about Marshall Goldsmith as a friend of mine, and Marshall told me that when he goes to interview a client as an executive coach, and he always deals with basically all of his work is with CEOs. Part of that contract, so to speak, is talking to the family structure to understand how decisions are made in the household. And he said lots of times these so-called leaders will back away from that because they don't want you to touch that. They just only want you to deal with the work side of it and not get the full 360 kind of as to what you're talking about.
Yep. And I will tell you, Ron, whether I'm working with consumer research or I'm working with a CEO, cars, shoes, and animals are the three disassociated things that I can always use to bring the conversation back to reality, because we all relate to those three things on an emotional level. I know you in shoes. You've got the best shoes I have ever seen. I could talk to you about shoes all day long.
I laughed because I thought of that. I said, damn, you hit the first two right off the bat. You hit the first two, right off the bat. Cars, kind of a car fanatic, and then you talked about shoes. So you had me right there. And, the other concept I'm thinking about is that when you pull someone away, and for people that are con people, salespeople, if you go to buy a car and you look in the car and you're undecided about making a decision, they may throw you a question that takes you right away from it. It said, I like this car, but that's not my color. And they would say, well, what is your color? My color is black. If I could have that black car for you in this model available for you by next Friday, would you be interested? That whole thought process just switches away from that, where we were going down to the decision-making piece. Yes, go ahead.
That's right. But what they've just done is they've listened to you. Mm-hmm. They've just used your rules, right, Ron? Yeah. They've listened to you. They're understanding where your ambition and aspiration is, and they're bringing it back in. If I can understand what you want and then shape that around your needs, does it become worth it? Because I'll tell you something, we all have a number in mind for lots of different things.
Yeah.
And that number is really quite ephemeral.
Yeah.
We'll compromise on the number over and over and over again to get what we want, because numbers are not what we want. They're what we need. They may prove things, but what we want has a lot more to do with how we're reflected in the world. And I'm never going to walk around the world and say, hey, I'm $100,000 or I'm $1 million.
Yeah.
Right? I want you to relate to me based on the things that are important to me.
I'm going to take this conversation in a different angle, because this is what bothered me the other day. I noticed that when Bezos went to the so-called space, and he said, I want to thank all of my customers and all of my employees because you paid for this. And my thought was, oh, wow, what were you thinking in making this such a bold statement on a global stage? And meanwhile, you have all of these articles across the globe.
Okay.
So what I'm saying, go ahead, give me your interpretation of that, because that kind of threw me for a loop.
Yeah. First of all, we paid for NASA. That's what we paid for. That was our tax dollars. And you know what? That was a part of my childhood. That was a part of my pride in being an American, and the space race, and and my desire to study science and technology and math. It was magical times, and it was inventive times. This guy's being selfish, and quite frankly, if he'd pay his taxes, maybe I wouldn't have to subsidize. You know what, Ron? It made me pretty mad, and it made me further disassociate from the values of Amazon. I am not here to give Jeff Bezos an experience. And he should understand what they're here for, because they will be disintermediated. They are not, he is no longer listening.
No longer
his algorithms may be, but he's not.
And when I saw that, I had just ordered my granddaughter and grandson some decorations for their lights, and I said, so you're telling me that when I clicked submit, 1 cent of that went towards this space thing? And I was just thinking, oh my God, totally clueless. But let's get away from that, because we can go into a different conversation and really go down a hole on that. You mentioned the concept of prototyping. Give us some insights on prototyping and what that means.
Yeah. So, the practice we have at Nucleus in branding is, and quite frankly, let me describe and define branding. A lot of people think branding is a logo. That's the end state. That may be the packaging of a brand. But what branding is understanding why people do or don't connect to a concept. And we engage in the practice of branding to ultimately create some behavior or behavior change. But between this concept that we want people connected to and behavior or behavior change is persuasion. Now, my definition of that is values alignment, not a bunch of information, right? You can give people all the facts in the world, but that doesn't necessarily create a behavior or behavior change. So in that bucket of persuasion, none of us know 100% of the time how people are going to behave. And if we think about that from the organizational perspective out, we will make mistakes. So what we have to do is build an evidence-based practice of developing interventions and products and programs. But if I go all in, I'm taking too much risk. So I believe in interviews and research and collecting evidence, building a prototype, testing that prototype, and then making the investment and rolling that out. Now that could be an intervention in the developing world for creating demand for immunization or health services, or that could be the prototyping of some brand values for a jewelry startup that then gets refined after we listen to the employee audience and the consumer audience. So we're always prototyping, testing, and taking the risk out of just launching something because somehow magically we know everything.
Exactly. So so you go through that process, and then you begin the process of scaling, whether that be nationally, whether that be multiple stores or globally or whatever it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I read in one of your articles, you mentioned ladder versus lattice, the career model of people building their careers. And I know lots of people have been impacted severely by COVID-19, either through layoffs or careers have been stalled, and they're trying to figure out, from the organization perspective, if this was kind of a reimagining everything, so if we had a clean slate to start all over again, how would you advise organizations to build in a new so-called career mobility, if that's what the employees were looking for, versus the latter of I'm moving up to director to AVP, SVP, all of that, versus I can do this. Maybe I want to be a subject matter expert. I don't want to deal with all that.
I'm going to go back to our days together at Martha Stewart. I think at some point in your office where I was frustrated, you might have either invoked Myers-Briggs or another one of those tests to help me understand how I was wired and how my boss was wired, right? And how to deal with that. I think there's a bigger role to play in understanding how we're wired, how an organization is wired. I think there are some people that are incredibly comfortable seeing what comes next, and they're goal oriented and they move in that way. I think there are other people that are hardwired experience collectors and skill builders. And I'll put myself in that category. I didn't want my boss's job or my boss's boss's job. I didn't want Martha's job. I loved that they all had those jobs. I was interested in expanding my base of knowledge and skills. And I had considerable skills and energy to bring. So I think organizations have to be agile enough to allow for ladder climbers and allow for experience builders, because then you have some systemic understanding along with leadership tracks. Think about how many creative people you and I managed at Martha Stewart. These are not always the greatest managers in the world. And why would you take a creative person out of their craft and into management if what they want is expansion, but not hierarchy?
So my going back, and I'm going to reference this again from the Martha Stewart days, we would take people who were subject matter experts, and on Monday morning they came in, they were managing that team, and it was always a disaster. And then I'd have to come in and kind of clean it up and work with people, coaching them through. And what I didn't really understand the concept of it then, but I realized that we were putting people into positions and we weren't preparing them for that. Or as Corn Ferry says, you ask first. You ask them whether they would want a role to manage a team of people, because they may come back. And my daughter was the one that kind of pulled my coat on that. She said, I don't want a career like yours. I don't want to be a vice president, EVP. I just want to do interesting work and be good at it. So don't ever try and put your model onto me. And I was like, okay, you're the coach and I'm the coachee. Okay.
Right.
But I never
great?
forgot that. Yeah.
And I amen to your daughter, because the interesting thing is, why are there only financial rewards for ladder climbers? What if you have the world's greatest designer or the world's most experienced recipe developer? You have to create financial mechanisms and incentives
Yes.
for them to be excellent, but
Mm,
not rise in a structure that doesn't reward them for what
mm,
they're great at.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so as we begin to close that, I wanted to ask you if you could, because your work is global, you do your profit. I mean, your for-profit organizations, nonprofit. If you could give some advice, if all of our listeners were CEOs who were in the throes of trying to get this thing back on track, what are three takeaways that you would give for them to say, here's what I think you should do, or here's my thoughts on that?
Number one is turn off your expert mind and turn
Mm,
on your learning mind.
okay.
Curiosity, listening, and relearning is what's going to get us out of this. And
Mm-hmm.
my fellow CEOs are leaders because they have excellent learning minds, but oftentimes their egos or the needs of others make
Yeah.
them feel like they have to be experts. So
Mm-hmm.
give yourself permission to turn your learning mind back on. That's number
Mm,
one.
mm,
Number two is generosity. The only thing we have to give as leaders is our time. And the only thing we've got as human beings is time.
mm.
Our job is to give our time to others because it's those people that actually make the metrics work. So the learning mind and giving time. And the last thing I'll say is you've got to remember to laugh. These are very difficult times. And even curling your mouth into a smile, being
Yeah.
generous with your laughter takes the sting and the tension out of a room and reminds all of us that we still have an ability to take a deep breath and go back at it.
Yeah. You know, one of the antidotes that I use for that is that when, we all have these days that we're thinking about. I always call my college roommates and I, the buddies from high school, and it's just like you're a kid again, and you just laugh, you're all over the couch laughing about things that happened umpteen years ago, but it still brings a different feeling. And when you finish that call, you're in much better shape.
Oh,
Just from
yeah.
the
Oh, yeah.
laughing part. And that may not, so they would never probably teach that in a leadership development course. But what I'm saying is the fact that it has an effect if we kind of let go sometime and kind of let the air out of our perceived ego that we may have, which we all tend to build up over a period
Yeah.
of time.
And Ron, maybe it should be in leadership development classes, right? Maybe we should give people permission to
Yeah.
laugh a little bit,
Yeah. Yeah. So I say that because I use that in one of my sessions, and I ask people to think back through their lives and who had the greatest impact on them as a leader. Who do they refer to maybe once a week or once a month? They go back to it, maybe a quote that someone said. And one of the things I found out in doing that across the globe is that for the most part, it's not a manager. It is a grandmother. It is an uncle. And these kind of stories, and I have people, so everyone has to kind of get up and tell their story. And people get emotional because they think, one gentleman told me about his grandfather. He stayed with his grandfather for the summer, and his grandfather owned a factory. He would take his grandson into every meeting. After the meeting, he'd sit down and explain to him exactly what they were trying to achieve and all these kinds of things. He said, I didn't think anything about it. I was bored. I was ready to get back and play with my toys. But as I got older, all of those lessons kept coming back to me over a period of time. And I found that to be very effective. Yeah.
Yep. Whenever we start a meeting, a facilitation, whether it's with ministries of health in the developing world or a corporate client, when we go around the room and ask everybody to introduce themselves, we'll ask for your name and what you do in the organization. And then there's always a bonus question.
Okay.
And that bonus question might be, what superhero cape would you wear? Who do you fight
Mm.
for? We're always trying to break people
Yeah.
out of the answer they think they have to give and
Yeah.
bring them again into that limbic brain, into an emotional, vulnerable space, so that everybody in the room knows that you can't take the feelings out of it, because it's what gets you here, right?
Mm.
When purpose and passion meet, you get acceleration. And that passion, it comes from the heart and the muscles. It's physical, it's emotional. You got to
Yeah.
bring these things together.
Mm. Mm. Well, you know that sometimes technology companies will reach out to me and say, "Here's our app. Take a look at this app. It can increase engagement. It can increase your leadership capabilities, all those kinds of things." And my normal reply is, if a leader can't say thank you and I appreciate the work you do, no app is going to ever solve that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's
Elizabeth,
human touch.
it's human touch. Thank you. Thank you so much for making time for us today. Really appreciated all the insights you brought to us. It's been great. And last time we had breakfast was here in Dubai about maybe 5 years ago. You were pitching a client here, and
Yeah.
we had a nice breakfast that morning. So hopefully we'll do that again when I get back to New York. So thank you so much for being a guest. Just hold on for a second as we begin closing out.
Thank you, Ron. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.